One of Australia's prime ministers just disappeared when he went for a swim in the ocean, so probably that. What historical mystery is unlikely to ever be solved? I'm not going to lie, I spent a lot of time just browsing these and looking at what people said. Thanks everyone, I learned a lot. Though I also didn't because it's unlikely many of these mysteries will ever be solved. For me, my ancient one is where Alexander the Great is buried. I've been interested in classics for years now, and that's always been a question that I've asked, both where it is and if we'll ever find it. As for the more recent one, this is more difficult, there's plenty for me. I'd have to say a mystery from where I'm from, New Zealand. It's the disappearance of Kirsa Jensen, a 14-year-old who went missing in 1983 while out riding her horse. It's quite significant within a New Zealand context because unsolved disappearances like this simply aren't that common. Basically, as I said, she was out riding her horse on night of September 1st, 1983. Her horse was later found alive, but she hasn't been seen since. All signs point to foul play, that she was abducted and murdered that night. That's what I believe, too. Unfortunately, we will most likely never know. It's worth noting about that case that a man named John Russell, who already had a rape conviction, was seen as a suspect by police at the time. His house and truck was searched, albeit with no evidence that Kirsa had been there being located, and he even confessed to the killing in 1985 but retracted it later, and police never had enough evidence to prosecute him. Ultimately, police said that there was more suggesting he wasn't involved than that he was, but he committed suicide in 1992 and left no suicide note, no last confession or anything. Perhaps he could no longer live with what he did, if he indeed did do it. Again, it's unlikely we will ever know. He took what he may or may not have known with him to the grave. Whatever happened to the Sodder children? There are too many unsolved cases involving children. The Beaumont children are the main ones in Australia, though a few years later 2 young girls were kidnapped from Adelaide Oval, possibly by the same person. Though we'll never know for sure, the most likely suspect is dead. I remember hearing a story about the Beaumont case. I think it went something like a detective was writing a book on the case decades after the fact. He starts researching a suspect who was now deceased, goes to the house where he used to live and interviews his widow. While there, he goes to the basement and finds a purse that matched the description of one that was owned by one of the missing girls that was never found. When he asks the widow where the purse was from, she tells him to leave. The next day, when he gets permission to seize the purse, the wife says she threw it away. I believe the suspect was Harry Phipps, who was mentioned in another comment. The book is The Satin Man. There were some other compelling anecdotes as well, with his supposed tendency to pay people with $1 notes. What Pope Leo said to Attila the Hun. Attila was taking over the world and made it to Rome and the Vatican. Leo rode out alone and spoke to Attila and convinced Attila to not destroy Rome and the Vatican. What was said, only the archives of the Vatican has any idea. I'm a fan of trade wind cycle theory causing the impetus for collapse. Climate change, every 1,800 years, where the Saharan trade winds shift upward temporarily to displace the Mediterranean. This in turn prompted several civilizations to collapse as rainfall ceased and put stress on the Sardinians, who had extensive trade networks with the eastern Mediterranean. Imafan, the Sardinians, or Muraca, were an offshoot of Minoan colonies that merged with native Belbeker after a failed colonization attempt in Iberia around 4000 to 3000 BC. Combined, that has a similar bull sun and moon god religious systems, and it's possible the earliest threads of this people began in Anatolia prior to Cyprus and Crete becoming inhabited. And I suspect, given their caches of iron and bronze ingots with Brahmic demarcations, they may be the actual ancestors of the trade networks that the Phoenicians used to rise to power. Interestingly, Etruscan housing roofs echo those of Nuragic towns. And given Minoans did have a form of gladiator combat, the Nurag also did, a sort of boxing shield has been found repeatedly. It's possible the Etruscans were a sort of hybrid culture of Sardinians and Greeks. It's very possible our way of looking at these people as independent is wrong. It seems better to view them as tribes that could confederate depending on interests. Technologically, they built complexes that wouldn't be rivaled until the Middle Ages and castles 3,000 years later. They are mostly unknown because most of the writings on them, while extensive, are stuck as untranslated local dialects. I'd say Western academia is around 40 years behind modern-day research. over 5,000 Iraq at Sardinia and nearby islands, approximately 1 per mile, and most are completely unexamined. The guy in a Max Headroom mask that hijacked a doctor who broadcast in, I believe, Chicago in the 80s, to this day no one knows who it is. There was a great threat a few years back from a guy who thought he knew the people who did it. He eventually got in touch with them, and they claimed they didn't, but you do have to wonder. Also, the doctor who hijacked was their second attempt. They initially hacked into the signal during the evening news, but there was no sound and station technicians blocked them out after a few seconds. Late at night, when there were no technicians on duty, they tried again more successfully. Where the Sumerians came from. It's fascinating how the first people to invent writing and settle in great cities, Eridu, Uruk, speak a language totally unrelated to the languages of the people around them, who spoke Semitic. Languages. A theory says they emerged out of the Ubaid culture and were indigenous to Mesopotamia, while another goes so far as to claim they came from the area of the Persian Gulf before it was flooded at the end of the last ice age. Some others believe they are related to the Indus Valley civilization, which they supposedly called Meluhha. While this comment blew up, I would like to recommend this excellent episode of the Fall of Civilizations series podcast on the subject. It's great, and be sure to check the excellent reply to my comment just below. I agree it's an interesting problem, but it's also kind of what you'd expect. Most of the languages of that region were simply never recorded. It could have been an isolate at the time writing was being innovated, or it could have been part of a larger family with relatives in India or Africa. We aren't going to know because only the speakers in this one region were using that system until it was adapted for language families. Centuries later, like Akkadian or Hittite. And it's not like language isolates are truly isolate. All languages come from other languages. Go far enough back and Sumerian and Proto-Afro-Asiatic could have had a common source. Okay, probably not that particular pair. You get the idea. Elamite's another isolate from the period, but it could easily have a distant relationship to Dravidian or Caucasian families or something. And if it didn't, then it has a relationship with unknown languages. The Semitic speakers who conquered and integrated Sumer were themselves far removed from their language family's original homeland. What's more, their branch of Semitic, Eastern, is extinct. Sumerians' relatives could have just become extinct at a time before it was possible to record them. However, I do think it most likely that Sumerians were not indigenous to that delta. Their mytho-historical accounts of having traveled from a southern land notwithstanding, they appear to have had a different skin tone to their immediate neighbors. Linguistically, there is still much we don't know, but the large amount of homonyms suggests a tonal or pitch-accented system, which would also be innovative for the region. But in case this is the reason for anyone's interest, I would stress that there is more than sufficient evidence that they innovated writing there, rather than having brought it with them from elsewhere. We have a good 5-6 centuries of proto-writing from them and can trace the origin of many cuneiform signs to pictographs on coins and tokens. A relationship with the Harappan civilization is non-existent, in my view. Indus Valley writing is proto-writing and shares none of the characteristics of Sumerian proto-writing. A related mystery I'm keen on is whether writing was culturally diffused from Sumer to Egypt, or whether they were independent innovations. They are certainly independent systems, but they could have been a related or interdependent innovation early in the proto-writing stage that allowed their independent development. And they seem like neighbors, but there's no evidence of trade between them at this stage, and people didn't travel it far without good reason.